Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. We've got an exciting show for you today, and something a little bit off the beaten path. When I say fan fiction, what do you think of? Because it's impossible for me to hear you, let me answer that. You probably think of someone in a dark basement, hammering away at a keyboard, writing something like the 37th chapter in their Orion love slave epic, or maybe a story about Kirk and Spock recreating the Kama Sutra, or a Mary Sue story. And the thing is, you're probably not exactly wrong, but you're missing quite a lot of the rest of the picture. Fan fiction, especially Star Trek fiction, or Trek fic, is an expansive and rarely acknowledged part of fandom that is full of creativity, diversity, and honestly may have saved Star Trek fandom as we know it after the show's cancellation in 1969. You may not know a lot about Trek fic, and that's okay, neither did I, so I got in touch with 3 fic veterans to ask them about the fic community and their own work. Liz Barr of Antimatter Pod, Sasha Wood of Casually Comics, and writer Steph Roehler are all joining me on the show today for a fun and hopefully educational talk about the history and present of Star Trek fanfiction. And we're going to get right to it. If you're not following us on social media, do that. We're at EISTPOD on all the places. And don't forget to join us on Thursday nights for our live recap show reviewing the latest episodes of Lower Decks, Star Trek Prodigy, and Discovery. That's it from me. Enjoy the discussion. I've got to get back to work on my Tom Paris in Paris with Valeris fic. And with that, let's get underway. I have a trio of guests on the show today. First up, she is a writer, podcaster, and the winner of the 2019 Dittmer Award for Best Fan Writer for her blogging work at squiddishly.net. She's one half of the hosting duo behind Antimatter Pod, a Star Trek podcast about fashion, feminism, subtext, and subspace. It's Liz Barr. Liz, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again.
It's great to have you here. Next up, she's an editor and producer, and she's the host of the YouTube channel Casually Comics, where she talks about comic books and comic storylines, new and old. It's Sasha Wood. Sasha, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm glad to be back.
It's great to have you back. And finally, she is a writer and freelance journalist with bylines at Comic Book Resources, Screen Rant, The Mary Sue, and other outlets. She's also written about mental health representation and queerness for StarTrek.com. It's Stephanie Roehler. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Welcome to the show, Stephanie. It's great to have you all aboard. And something that I always do when I have new guests on the show is to ask how they first became a Star Trek fan. And I've heard from Liz and Sasha on their stories with Trek, but Stephanie, how did you first discover Star Trek?
So my dad was a huge sci-fi nerd. I grew up just immersed in things like Dune and Star Wars and etc. And so he had a bunch of collections and bookshelves of different movies, VHSs, and books. And there was just this giant ominous shelf that had every single VHS copy of The Next Generation.
Oh, yeah.
And one summer, for some reason, I looked at it and I was like, I'm gonna watch every single one. And I did. And it was, for some people, they say downhill from there, but I think it's uphill from there.
Sure.
And it just became one of my favorite shows to watch. And it was a good comfort show.
It's so fortuitous that your family had all those tapes.
Mm-hmm.
And a young person now would ostensibly have, all of Star Trek to watch on streaming, which for some would be fine, but for others may be overwhelming. But for you, you had the entirety of TNG at your fingertips, monolithic. And, it's 2 per tape, right? There's 2 episodes every tape. So it's bingeable, but it's still analog enough for you to kind of reflect.
Yeah, I think what I would go for was try to watch 1 tape at least every day.
Sure.
That was what I went for, and it worked. And I watched every single one.
How old were you when you were doing this?
I think I was roughly 10.
Okay.
And I would randomly decide projects for myself as a kid. I like school. And so I would pick an arbitrary project. And that summer it was watch every single episode of TNG.
What were some of your other summer projects?
One summer I decided to write a book. A different summer, I decided to get my biking time down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Have you continued that into your adult life?
100%, but now it's just not summer. It's just always
just
a little more
just
stressful.
Project after project. Yeah. Sasha, I knew that you grew up watching Star Trek with your dad on VHS tapes, and I know that your kids are young, but have you thought about the day when you might sit them down and say, okay, kids, this is Star Trek?
I haven't thought about it like it'll happen like that consciously. I feel like I'll just be watching an episode and they'll just be there.
Oh, okay,
I feel
yeah,
like that's
sure.
far more likely to end up happening because I do sometimes just occasionally pick one of my favorite episodes and be like, today is Space Seed Day, and then just sit and watch that. So
Yeah, I would imagine that some forms of Trek would be a little more visually interesting for kids, and then other ones like the talkie kind of ones are like, what else is on?
I'm really excited for Prodigy to help get kids into Trek easier.
Yeah, well, that'll be very visually interesting. Yeah, with what we've seen so far.
Yeah.
I can't remember, Sasha, if we've talked about it, but do your kids understand what you do with Casually Comics, or do they think that mommy's just talking to herself with her dolls or something?
They're still too young to understand it. I think my oldest just has the concept that like I film videos and they somehow are on the computer, and she likes to help out with like looking through the viewfinder and those kind of things. But the concept of it, of what it actually means, is not there. No.
Okay. All right. Well, someday, you'll have to introduce them to your love of comic books someday too.
That one's already started, actually. My daughter has started collecting those little kind of adaptations of fairy tales. They're like redone for like a more modern audience, and they have like robots in them and all kinds of stuff like that. So
I haven't heard of these. I want to get my hands on these. What are they called?
They're called Far Out Fairy Tales, and they're done by a bunch of different comic book authors, including some of like the greats from back in the day, like Louise Simonson and the like, have tried their hands at some of the stories. So they're a lot of fun.
Okay. I got to check that out. Liz, I know that you come from a long line of sci-fi fans, and I remember you telling me that your parents would rent TNG tapes, and I was thinking that there's an entire generation, maybe two now, who will never know what the inside of a video store looked like. They're all just nail salons or Starbucks or mattress kings now.
Yeah, my brother was trying to explain to his kids what a video store was, and they were like, but it's in the TV. Everything you want to watch is in the TV, Dad.
Yeah. It was just a big part of how I found movies to watch when I was younger. Yeah. You go through the rows, you look at the box art, you read the back matter and try to figure out I've got $2.50. Is this worth being one of the tapes that I get? Yeah. Now you have the Netflix thumbnail and maybe a trailer, and that's it. It's way less tactile.
Yeah. I was really a nerd though. I would get those film guides from the library and scout out stuff that sounded interesting. And sometimes movies would look absolutely fantastic in the Hallowell's guide, and then I would see the VHS cover and it was tacky and horrible and clearly completely inappropriate. So I'd have to wait for some occasion when my parents were distracted before I got that video.
Okay. Yeah, I used to read the TV guide supplement in the paper, and never have time or the inclination to watch the movies, but just sort of not consciously memorize, but end up memorizing the 20-word blurb for every film. So I could tell you the date and the blurb for a film that I've never seen, but I know when it was released and I know who's in it. Roy Scheider's in that one. Yeah.
So many movies I know about and have never seen and probably will never see.
Yeah, probably for the best. There's been a few big announcements in non-Trek sci-fi recently, and two of you are from Commonwealth countries. Maybe the third's a Doctor Who fan. So what do you think of the news that Russell T Davies is returning to run the next season of Doctor Who?
Ooh, I didn't hear about that. That's exciting.
Oh!
Yeah.
I missed that. I'm pretty excited. I may be ruffling feathers by saying this, but I always thought Stephen Moffat was a great single story writer, not a great arc writer.
Sure.
And so I preferred Russell T Davies' more arc style. But who knows if it'll work now? I haven't watched Doctor Who in a while. I don't know.
I was just gonna say, because I got into it in the Russell T Davies era, but I'm really curious how that type of storytelling will translate now, because it's just that time and distance from when he was working on it then to now, your style changes and just naturally over time.
Yeah.
I'm excited because I had strong negative opinions about the Russell T Davies era, but at the same time, I watched the show and had a lot of feelings about it. Whereas with Chibnall, I just drifted away because I was bored. So, if nothing else, I'm looking forward to feeling engaged again, even if I'm just yelling at the TV every couple of weeks.
Well, you have to do that. I have to say that I haven't seen anything of Russell T Davies since he left the show, although I know that he's been doing other work and has been winning awards. And so I think, like, I'm optimistic. I think that his Who has a certain style that informed everything that's obviously come after the relaunch, but I'm not sure if his style will work or fit in well now. But I think that he's probably a better writer than he's ever been and clearly loves the material. So yeah, I say give it a spin and see what happens.
Yeah.
Stephanie wrote recently for the Mary Sue about Star Trek Prodigy and how it was cool that Prodigy would
I did.
Yeah, you did.
I read so often that I'm like, oh, when did that happen?
Yeah, you were talking about upping the alien factor, on this show. We've always had to settle for human-looking aliens in live-action Trek for obvious reasons, but there's another sci-fi show that made a point of having very elaborate alien designs and makeup, and that's Babylon 5. And Babylon 5 will be the next show to get a reboot with original series creator J. Michael Straczynski at the helm.
That's very exciting because I could never sit myself down and make myself watch Babylon 5.
Oh, yeah. What about it kept you away
I think
from
it's just like, it was right at the point where it was old enough where my brain was like, this feels like vintage sci-fi and I can't comprehend it.
Interesting.
Like Star Trek was vintage sci-fi, but I understood the logic. Babylon 5 was just like a little bit, I'm showing my young millennial age here, but it like felt a little bit too, and I didn't want to, and it just couldn't compulse myself to start. And then I'd watch more Star Trek.
There's a certain like budgetary level. I mean, sci-fi in the 80s or early 90s, you're not going to have a lot of money either way. And I think Star Trek had a little bit more money, but never really looked all that cheap. They like hit it well. And sometimes I'd watch Babylon 5 and think, oh boy, they're really stretching it here. And so I can see that sort of visual idea you're talking about. Then I went on to watch, like Doctor Who and Blake 7 and Space 1999, and they've got like cardboard boxes and things like that. So it's not really that big of a deal. Any other B5 fans?
Yes. My secret shame as a Trekkie is that I like B5 better than DS9.
Okay. All right.
And
sure.
As a very hardcore B5 fan who really loves the show, I am deeply excited about this reboot. I'm curious and a little hesitant that it's not actually a straight up remake, because honestly, I feel like the original show was very first drafty in a lot of ways. I always wanted to run a red pen over the scripts. So I'm very eager to see what comes out of this. And I'm curious that it's being done by the CW, which doesn't really have a great track record in terms of quality adult science fiction.
Yeah.
But at the same time, JMS has a lot of experience working with, weird production companies and no money. And I really think he could, I feel like if he can pull lightning out of a hat, pull a rabbit out of a hat a second time, that would be amazing.
I wonder how they'll getting to do it in like the 21st century, and then of course up against the whole Trek revolution, like how they'll want to try and counter program against that, or if they will.
Yeah, it's interesting that modern Star Trek and so much modern 21st century sci-fi has borrowed from Babylon 5 in its aesthetics. The blue and orange backgrounds, the blue uniforms. It's like there's a clear through line from B5 to Mass Effect to The Expanse to Discovery. And so it feels like we're coming full circle.
Yeah. Just out of nowhere, a plug for Foundation. One of the things that I like about Foundation is that it has a very interesting art design, a very interesting production design and look to it. And it isn't, you can't tell what it's borrowing from, or it's just borrowing from everything and kind of mashing it all together. And so it isn't too Star Wars. It's not too Star Trek. There's no that blue and orange. They've kind of, there's a past sequence that has a more kind of rustic look, and there's a future sequence that has a little cooler J.J. Abrams Star Wars kind of thing. But you always have to think about that when we're going to make this show or we're going to remake this show, and there's all these other Star Trek or sci-fi shows on, like how do we distinguish ourselves? And I'm interested to see what they come up with.
And certainly the aesthetic of the original Babylon 5 was in many ways a reaction against the beigeness of TNG. So I'm curious to see how it responds again to Star Trek.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining me on the show today. And our topic is one that I think many Star Trek fans are completely ignorant of. I know that I was for the most part. And yet it's an expansive and creative part of fandom, and in many ways was one of the things that kept Star Trek fandom alive after TOS went off the air. And it's arguable that we might not have Trek today without it, and that's fan fiction, especially Star Trek fan fiction. And I should note that when we talk about fiction, we're not just talking about short stories that you read in zines. We're also talking about scripts and poetry, reference material, games, audio recordings, films and fan films. All of these things can be fan fiction. And, I had to do a lot of research for the show on the internet. So it's good. And, It's probably more popular than ever, fan fiction. It's certainly more accessible than ever, but it's really hard. It was hard for me to determine what the first fanfic or the first fanfic communities were or gathered around. There have been works of, quote unquote, legitimate fiction that have fanfic qualities throughout the years. And I think we can probably get through this without discussing 50 Shades of Grey at all. But I think it's true that the first fic works based on a pre-existing franchise or characters, at least the first widely distributed ones, were Star Trek fanfics.
Yeah,
definitely
I think
some of the earliest, that's for sure. Some of the other early shows out there, like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and stuff, have it, but it doesn't take off in the same way that it does in the Star Trek community. There's just something about Trek that people really latched onto, especially because when it was airing in syndication in those reruns and people were just watching it passively, it just really activated something. And it really was key in not only just keeping it alive, but in getting the con circuit to really come together so that these people could meet and, share all their fiction together. And there was just so much excitement about it. And there still is. It's very interesting because, like you said, fan fiction is now more known than ever, I would say, and more accessible, but still just as misunderstood as it's ever been.
That's what we're hoping to combat today.
There was certainly Sherlock Holmes fiction, back in the day, even in Conan Doyle's lifetime, but that didn't have the amateur quality that marked Star Trek fan fiction and sort of the beginning of media fandom. And it's interesting to me that you look at the early fanzines and the discussion around fan works, and they called it Treklit, and they talked in terms of, we want to write Star Trek stories that could win a Hugo Award.
Sure.
That there was no artificial barrier between fan work and pro writing.
Yeah. I don't think I'm even old enough to really have interfaced with zines, but they existed before Star Trek.
Yeah.
And while researching, I found an excerpt from a fanzine from 1939 called Les Zombies, where someone was complimenting another person's story. The story wasn't in it, but they were giving them a compliment about this story that they wrote, and they said that it sounded professional and not like fan fiction. So at least not in general usage, but that term was around back then. And I think the first fanzine dedicated to Star Trek was Spockanalia, which was published from 1967 to 1970, and it debuted during the show's first season. So even at that point, fans were engaged with the show and making their own art and fiction about it.
And I think Spockanalia, certainly a lot of the zines arose out of resentment in existing science fiction fanzines that suddenly everyone was talking about Star Trek. And that wasn't real proper science fiction. That was just that nonsense on TV that housewives liked. So in traditional fandom fashion, those housewives went off and started their own thing. And here we are now, 50 years later, talking about it.
We're going to build our own edifice. Yeah, we don't need you.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That creative instinct, is a natural one, I think. But like Sasha was saying before, I think the way that the fan base took to creating their own stories, there was definitely a passion there. And I think that, like we said, there was a pre-existing framework or a tradition already in place. I don't know if some TOS fans were writing Flash Gordon or Commando Cody or Batman fics, before TOS came out, but the audience seemed primed to just throw themselves into this and create and engage with the material in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Kirk Spock fic / fandom dominates the conversation, but it's worth remembering that a lot of the early fic was basically straight up original stories about the crew having adventures and visiting strange new worlds. And they considered themselves serious science fiction writers. And there was a lot of resentment of the slashes and the het romances and, you know, getting their girl cooties over everything.
Yeah, right. Do you remember how you personally first got started in writing fan fiction? Stephanie, can you tell us what drew you to fan fiction?
Oh boy. So, you know, as a youngin', I was one of those people that was like that, was like, fan fiction's dirty. Like that's a bad thing people do.
Yeah.
And if I ever wrote any, I like kept it really secret and like didn't write it very often. But as most people got a new hobby at the beginning of the pandemic, I got extra more into Star Trek and also very much into The Witcher. And I like, there was something about the dynamic of like either being two close buddies or like two people that were kind of opposites of each other and falling in love. Like it just really hit me. Because my husband and I are a lot like that. And it was just very comfortable for me. And so I fell into the, you know, lovely spurk hole that people like to make fun of. But I feel like there's something lovely there for a lot of queer people to be able to see your stories in something that feels sort of real. Like Star Trek is a real thing. And maybe they didn't say in the stories that spurk is a thing, but because it's real characters that were syndicated, it now feels like it's, you know, a hair away from being real. And it's something
that's interesting. Trying to sort of manifesting that thing in the world. Liz, what about you?
From a very, very young age, I would sort of glom onto TV characters or book characters and tell myself stories about them. I remember being about 4 years old and going to bed after watching a soap opera with my mum and continuing the story in my head. When I was about 11, I read a book about Star Trek fandom, and there was a chapter about Slash and Kirk's Spock's fic. And I was like, oh, that's very interesting. I guess I'm not the only person who does that. But I didn't really think about it again because I'm not really interested in stories about men. And I particularly struggle with the idea that Kirk is a character. Or anyway. But a few years later, my best friend and I were tooling around the internet. We were on dial-up. We were using the Lycos search engine, and we happened across something called the Janeway Chakotay Fanfiction Index.
Ooh.
And
wow.
I was a big Voyager fan. What I would learn was called a big Janeway Chakotay shipper. And my friend was like, ooh, Star Trek porn. I'm very into this. And I was like, oh my God, this fan fiction thing, they write it about women. They write it about the ships that I'm into. So I naturally started writing my own, and it was terrible. And I would go online once a week at my dad's office and post it. And I haven't really stopped.
That's great. Sasha, how about you?
I got into it pretty young. I think I was in middle school when I first discovered that it existed because one of the people that I hung out with printed off a Link Zelda thing and brought it into our little lunchroom table and was like, oh my God, you need to read this right now. And then he was like, I found it on this website called fanfiction.net. And so of course, like I went home and I just had to explore this website, and I found all of these people that were doing the same thing that I was. I was like, there are people who want the story to keep going, and they're just writing all of their different ideas. And it was so amazing. I'm like, other people care too. This is great. So it was so fun to go on there. And then the Star Trek one was, I ventured into it a bit later on. And that was so exciting because the world was so rich and there were so many different ones. And like Liz was saying, the Gen stuff gets overlooked, but there's some really amazing, like general fiction, just adventure works out there. Like it's really one of those things where there is something for everyone. Like whatever you are looking for in the fandom space, you'll probably find it. And if not, you can just ask for it and somebody will probably write it for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just Voyager porn. There's all kinds of stuff that you can read about or write about. Yeah. I don't have really any experience with fanfic, or at least I didn't think I did until I realized that a while ago in the sort of like instant messenger, social media days, I played for a couple years on a play-by-email sim. where you just, you had a character on a ship and you mailed what you were going to do in, or I think we used like Yahoo groups at some point to organize everything. And that's, I think that's a kind of a form of it. You're kind of doing like a cooperative, consensual, simulation of being on a ship. And I thought it was cool. And if you told me like, yeah, but it's Star Trek fanfic. No, this is a fic. What are you talking about? There's a lot of places to find Trek fic these days. You don't have to subscribe to a mimeograph zine. You mentioned fanfiction.net, and there's trekfanfiction.net. Archive of Our Own. I found fanlore.org to be an amazing and really overwhelming resource for learning about the past and the current history of fanfic. It's a wiki that chronicles many of the figures of the early days of fanfics, and there's interviews with them and fan in-jokes, and reading it is like stumbling across a private chat between old friends, and you're trying to keep up with all the references and innuendos, but I find it it's fascinating.
I spent a lot of time on Fanlore reading about the old Star Trek conflicts and the debates, and a wonderful panel that took place in 1977 where a bunch of women just sat down and criticized the feminism of other people's fics. And
Great.
like, you could not do that these days. You would end up in so much trouble. And this was like a conflict that went on for a year after the panel, but it was a wonderful insight into the culture and personalities of the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, just because you want to see more female voices doesn't mean that you necessarily love the female voice next to you, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a lot of categories of fic stories. We couldn't possibly talk about all of them, but I think it'd be important to talk about the ones that are related to Trek and the ones that Trek arguably helped to establish. And one of the most important ones is slash fic, which is generally held to have originated in Star Trek fandom, specifically with stories that pair Kirk and Spock romantically. The slash comes from Kirk/Spock, or K/S, or Spirk, as we heard before. And the term has gone on to mean a fic that means that it features a same-sex pairing, although fem/slash is also a term that denotes female-female pairing in a story.
Yeah, I mostly, I don't write a lot of dude slash, but I write a moderate amount of fem slash. And it was really exciting to me to discover the Janeway 7 shippers of the 1990s. And that was sort of my first encounter with a queer community, which was really important for me as a small Catholic kid growing up in a small town.
Yeah. Do any of you have a favorite site or resource for Trek fanfic?
I mean, it's not a favorite anymore, but like when I was into it, I had a similar experience of finding not like the Janeway Chakotay like fandom, but I was really interested always in the aliens on Star Trek. And I always wanted there to be more aliens. I was like, less humans, more aliens, please. And so I found this website called Cardassian Sutra, which was just like all of these Cardassian fics. And like, yeah, some of them, as you can imagine, based on the name, went to some places, but there were also some very like interesting just works about like the Cardassians and the culture. And I was just like, this is so fascinating that it was a really interesting place to hang out in.
Yeah. Something I see in fandom a lot is people talking about the Cardassians and like they're lizards, right? So like, do they like it warm? Do they bask in the sun? Do they shed their skin? Is there like a closet? Does Garrick have a closet full of like old Garrick skins or something like that? Like they want to know these biological things about them.
There's a whole subset of fan art that exclusively give Cardassians tails because they think it makes sense for lizards, and I like that.
Yeah, I want to make that canon, Discovery. Come on.
Yeah, I understand you didn't have the budget at the time, but the tails make sense.
But also, I just want to flag this. In Voyager, Seska breastfeeds her child. Like, they might be lizards, but they're a little bit mammalian.
That's true. Maybe that's just the Bajoran DNA working its way out or something like that.
Maybe we need to step away from this lizard-mammal binary.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, right, sure. Yeah, lizards can have breasts. Come on.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk recently, a lot of concern around representation in media and Star Trek in particular. And there's a lot of fans who are looking back at older series like TOS and TNG with a more modern eye, a more modern interpretation of the relationships between characters. But I find it like fascinating, like back in the 60s and 70s, they were just being explicit in fanfic about what they wanted to see from these characters, particularly male ones. And I think it's surprising. I mean, there have always been people who were forward thinking and pro LGBTQ rights before there was even a term for it. But I think it's fantastic that these young writers in the 60s were like, yeah, Kirk and Spock are making out. Like, that's what's happening.
I think that's true. But I also think it's you could go too far in conflating that with support for real world queer rights. Yeah. And I also want to flag that the whole concept of the Mary Sue was in many ways a legitimate criticism of an era common to new writers, but it was also a way of saying, actually, we don't want more women in these stories. Please keep your women away from our stories about manly men. Get your icky romance out of here. So I think, as always, fandom reflects the culture that it's coming from. And I think it would be really interesting to do a study analysing the development of, say, feminism or support for queer rights through fan fiction over the decades.
I would do whatever I could to fund that study if you wanted to do that.
Coming soon to a PhD near you.
Yeah. There's another category of early fic that stood out to me, which was the hurt comfort story, or HC, sometimes called a get 'em story, where a character that we're familiar with is tortured or wounded or put through something horrible. One of the first and most famous would be Spock Enslaved by Diane Steiner with art by Karen Flannery. It was one of the first full-length fanfic novels. It was originally published in zine form. There's also The Logical Conclusion, a novelette by Paula Smith with art by V.M. Weinman, which was published in 2 parts in Menagerie magazine. And both of those featured Spock basically like chained up and going through an ordeal.
An interesting twist on the genre now is that in Discovery you see a lot of hurt comfort fic where Michael is the one being comforted. And I think that really, like, she is such a giving character who is the support for everyone else. And so I think this is a case of fandom seeing an absence in the canon and going, yeah, someone needs to look after her for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Do you think, to everybody, that trends in fanfic often correlate to absences in the canon or in the stories, or 100%. Are they just? You think so?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, 100%. Oftentimes, like, people even explicitly state, like, this is a problem that we see and it's not like being addressed at all, so I'm going to address it here and now, is like often what happens.
That's interesting.
I have a lot on this because that's like my whole thing with Star Trek.
Yeah.
But I just opened my LGBTQ Star Trek Discord that started up over the pandemic. There are a lot of younger fans who got roped in during the J.J. Abrams movies, and then just like dove in past that. And there's something, I can't fully put my finger on it, that just really, like, it hits enough like queer buttons for people of the community that they can see something there and then build on it. That, like, we have a different chat for each different series, and there's different characters that everybody identifies with, and it's not just, slash stuff, but it also can be like, there's a lot of autistic people in here who really identify with Data. There's different non-binary people who really like Odo because he shifts between forms, and also Odo, there's a whole gender thing. Anyway, don't need to go into the whole gender theory of Odo. But
we'd be here all day.
But there's and it's people who are somewhat queer coded, and it's not just the one character. It's not like you go to not to brag on Discovery, but like you go to Discovery and there's the gay couple. Like, what's nice between the entirety of Star Trek is that there's a bunch of different characters with different queer features or things that people can identify with, so that they can turn them into a character they identify with and have stories with. It's really cool. And I love that.
There's definitely a change in fandom culture when there is canonical queerness versus when you have to read the subtext into it. And I don't think I don't think either is inherently bad. I'm delighted that we have canonical queer people and I
didn't mean that as a rag on Discovery. It's more just I identify with characters later. I have a whole weird gender fluid thing going on, which is why I normally lean towards male pairings, because I'm a male-ish kind of person on the inside.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's been someplace I could find myself. It's just, I think there is a discussion that perhaps the diversity has slowed down, not ended, obviously. Discovery is still doing leaps and bounds better than a lot of shows, but older things used to have first interracial kiss, first like do a lot of firsts in television. And it's kind of like ever since a certain producer which will be not named.
Rick Berman.
Yeah, that one.
There you
go. Things have been slowly coming to a slower halt, and Discovery's starting to pick it up. But it's easier to tell in the early seasons of Discovery, they were very afraid of pushing too far too fast.
Yeah, and I think certainly with season 3 and the addition of
season 3, they're doing great. Like
characters.
I'm very excited for what's upcoming. It's just, you could tell early on that Discovery was afraid of going too far.
Which is interesting because there have only been brief periods where it's had a straight showrunner.
Mm-hmm.
In the multitude of showrunners that it's had. My pet peeve with the Trek Renaissance is that Discovery, until recently, was the only place where queerness existed in the Star Trek universe. And meanwhile, Picard is trying to get cookies with the hand touch.
Yeah.
A more chaste hand touch
forget about that
than
every
TNG
time.
did.
Yeah.
And Lower Decks, to Mike McMahon's credit, realized that it had this heteronormativity problem and is fixing it in season 2. But it feels like Discovery is the only place where that is at the forefront of people's minds.
Yeah, there was a deep tragedy in my chat during the first season of Lower Decks where like Beckett gives goodbye vibes, and like every episode somebody would be like, now?
Yeah.
Now?
It was... We had exactly the same conversation in the Admiral Cornwell Discord, which is also like for half a dozen of us to talk about regular Star Trek. And both Raffi and Beckett were giving off major bye vibes, and we were so confused that it was never going there, except as an afterthought in the final episode of Picard.
Right.
And so I think fan fiction still has still serves that purpose of adding things back into places where they were absent. And that means, writing TOS fic where there are queer people. And I recently watched an episode of Star Trek Continues, the fan series, which attempts to explain why there were no female captains in the original series.
Yeah.
And
that last episode.
Yeah, first of all, I don't think you ever need to explain Turnabout Intruder or indeed acknowledge that it exists. But this series was written, it was fan fiction by men, and the result was really, really, really sexist. And I think that comes from being a fan work that is trying to slavishly recreate TOS, including its failings, rather than interrogating it.
There's a division between, I think, that kind of fan and the kind of person who enjoys and reads fanfic.
Yeah.
And that there's an obsession with canon, and they're trying to fix canon from within canon. And that's like the master's tools are not going to disassemble this house. You have to at least relax your mind and just say, well, maybe he said it wrong. Maybe that's not true. Maybe somebody had the wrong idea. Yeah.
And I am very much a chill with canon type of fan. And until Discovery blew up my favorite character, I didn't really like fix it fic as a label. I just think, I love this show. I would love it more if it did this. And then I write that story. Yeah. But I don't love I don't love canon that much.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely been cured of that recently as well. It's just not that big of a deal. We got to move on. Let's talk fast. We mentioned Mary Sue before, and just for, I don't know if any fans don't know, but just for fans who don't know, Mary Sue was a character in a tale written by Paula Smith in 1973, the short story A Trekkie's Tale, which was a parody fic about teenage Lieutenant Mary Sue, who's the coolest, most capable officer in the fleet. And as Liz mentioned, she mentioned it as a parody and criticism of how she saw other writers, particularly women, doing self-insert fics. That is, an author writing a character that's clearly meant to be them, and sort of a wish fulfillment tale. But the idea of Mary Sue, or Gary Stu, has gone on to have a life of its own, for good or bad. And I think if it had just stayed within the circles of fanfic and people sort of criticizing each other for maybe their contributions or their characters, that'd be one thing. But it has been given a completely new life in terms of media criticism, which I don't think that it ever was supposed to be there.
No. I understand the criticisms. Like, I don't enjoy other people's self-inserts. It's so self-indulgent. But it really irks me that Mary Sue was created as a tool to be used by women to critique other women's writing and has now become something used by everyone, but particularly men, and particularly anti-feminist men, to complain about the presence of a female character in any situation whatsoever.
Yes.
Like, as you say, there's been a conceptual drift here.
Yes, big time. And it's really unfair. I mean, I know that snarkiness and internal criticism is nothing unique to fandom, but I think it's understandable that when you love something so much, you want to see yourself in that world. And so you're going to write something, like that.
Absolutely. And if Jim Kirk can be this brilliant scholar and strategist and great captain and have a great friendship with Spock, then why wouldn't you also imagine a woman who could be his equal, or a Vulcan woman as logical and brilliant as Spock? I think
Yes.
there are no ordinary people on the Enterprise. So why would you want your original character to be Jane Boring?
Right. Lieutenant Boring.
Yeah.
We were talking before about it being sort of a feminist enterprise, at least early Trek fic, and the kind of non-feminist criticism that came from that. And now, we're seeing LGBTQ people expressing themselves in fanfic. Has there been like a similar backlash amongst queer writers to other queer writers' work and representation?
The only thing I can think of is there's a recurrence of that divide of people either like evangelizing their fic or damning the people who write like slash fic. Like being like, okay. I write this great queer art and these people just write porn. And it's like, they each have their place, my dude.
Sure.
There's no need to destroy each other with it because you each have different worlds within it.
Yeah. One thing I will say, like, I'm much more on the het side of fic, and when I first got into fandom, there was a real palpable homophobia in the het writing community, and that is almost entirely gone, and now people write het that is less heteronormative than in the past.
That's good.
Yeah, we're improving slowly.
Most of my research on fan fiction, a lot of the things we've talked about are old trends or categories of fic. Are there any current trends that you can name, or any categories of fic that you particularly enjoy creating or consuming?
Oh, I'd say the big one that I've seen a lot is happily ever after fic, which I'll explain it. It's basically where, particularly because a lot of my circles are queer, it'll be a queer couples being able to be together, have kids, and live happily ever after, and not die, majestically or dramatically. They just get to adopt some kids and go live their lives on their respective planets.
Sure.
And it's pleasant. It's nice.
Which you could never have on a show because it's got to go on week to week to week, and then there's always got to be a conflict. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think it's a conflating response to one, the show never ending kind of vibe, and also so many bury your gays problems that like people are like, can I just have my Garrick and Bashir retire to Cardassia and adopt some orphans, and like that's all they want. So I'm like, that's fine. That sounds beautiful.
Yeah, I love the idea that that people writing, especially like queer writers writing fic, can push the progressiveness of Star Trek forward. I don't think that like writers' rooms are like, go, what's in the fics today? But just creating an air of, wanting to see more from that kind of stuff. There's an anecdote about, people bringing KS fic to like Gene Roddenberry, and he's like, okay, yeah, I guess I could kind of see that. And then later, he's promising people, we're going to put gay characters on Star Trek. And it didn't happen. Yeah, it didn't happen in a timely fashion, but I mean, it's a positive thing. Or fans shipping Garrick and Bashir. Hell, Andy Robinson and half of the DS9 writing staff shipping Garrick and Bashir. And having them be, one of the most popular ships and inspiring more creativity and diversity. And it's a positive thing.
I think certainly when Brian Fuller was on Voyager, he was aware of the call for queer characters on that show. And then he went on to create Discovery. And although he left before Stamets and Culber were officially a couple, he was, in the planning stages for that. And I'm sure that was part of the reason.
Yeah.
But I also think like showrunners and writers will look at the culture as a whole, same as fic writers do.
Yeah. We should talk about ships or shipping, which exists alongside of fanfic and is a big part of it. I know Sasha has a completely separate YouTube channel, The Shipper's Guide to the Galaxy, where she talks about ships in media and fandom. I was trying to find the most popular Trek ships in fic and in Star Trek fic, and StarTrek.com did an article on the top 15 Trek ships based on stories from
archive. I looked at that yesterday.
Okay, all right. So you can cheat at this a little bit, but this comes from Archive of Our Own. Anybody want to take a guess as to who is in, say, the top 5?
Kirk Spock.
Yeah. I believe actually number 1 particularly was the special Mick Spurk special.
Yes.
Where it's McCoy, Spock, and Kirk in any sort of configuration.
Yep.
They're being a throuple or being like a triangle or whatever's going on. Garrick and Bashir, I believe, was on there.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if Picard and Beverly got to. I don't think they did.
Did Janeway and Seven make it?
Yes, they were.
Yes, Janeway and Seven were number 9 out of the 15.
I believe Janeway and Chakotay were second.
They were number 2. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's embarrassing. But...
yes, I'm embarrassed.
I think Jadzia and Worf were pretty high.
Interesting.
Jadzia and Kira are at 15. I don't think Jadzia and Worf made the 15 list.
That was my brain just making that up then, because
I
have
I was about to be really sassy and say good, but
I have a necessary Worf problem that I cannot explain. So probably something from childhood. I don't excuse it. It just is.
There are a couple that were kind of surprising to me, but now having this conversation with you guys, it makes more sense. Kelvin, Spock, and Uhura came in at number 4.
Oh,
and
that makes sense.
That's probably a lot of younger fans, yeah. And then Chekhov Sulu was at number 5.
Yeah, the sort of second string TOS.
What was number 3?
Number 3 was Bashir and Garrick.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And then at number 6 was Reed and Tucker. Yeah. Which was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then slightly down the line at number 11 was Archer and Reed. And I'm like, Archer and Reed?
Enterprise
I don't even
was
see
a weird
that.
show.
Yeah, it
I
was a
can
weird
remember
show.
I was in the fandom at that point and it got real interesting. I think at one point there was like a Reed/weapons ship going on. Like it got really interesting.
God, is
That's
this like the Draco in an apple thing?
Yes.
Oh, like Archer's like a dog. I mean, he's literally a dog person, but he's like a, water polo, running around, kind of tumbly kind of guy. And then Reed's like a cat. Reed's a cat person. They wouldn't go together.
I think the thing is because there's so little like strong male to female relationships going on other than to Paul and people.
Sure.
That the men who spent a lot of time together were the interesting part for people. Or there was more space to... Enterprise feels like a drunken blur to me. I feel like sometimes I remember it very vividly, and other times it's like, there were multiple seasons?
Yeah. I'm watching it for the first time now, and that's exactly how I feel. In fact, it's a lot better if you're drunk when you're watching it.
I'm sure it is.
I've yelled at the screen so many times watching Enterprise.
Yeah.
There's an entire subcult on Tumblr of people who have become indoctrinated by Faith of the Heart and think it's their favorite Star Trek theme now, and I hate it.
They think it's their favorite.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, you have been tricked. You watch too much.
I thought it was fascinating that out of the 15, Enterprise shows up 3 times.
It's
so
probably
that's...
because the fan fiction and AO3 sites became so much bigger during, the more 2000s
there's
kind of time.
There's a newness bias.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like, so many fics were lost, like, because so many things used to be kept on like forums or just individual websites or Angel Fire, and just some of them died and weren't kept up, and things weren't reposted. So like there are so many fics that exist that just are no more. Live Journal, so much gone.
Yeah, right. Oh, Live Journal.
I actually went through the alt.startrek.creative archives, like the actual posts, a couple of months ago for an episode of my own podcast. And it was amazing. There is so much fic that has been lost forever. And like Una McCormack's Deep Space Nine fic before she went pro is still out there, but you have to really dig for it. It was like so much conversation has been lost and is really hard to recover.
I know that when Yahoo Groups shut down, or when we got the message that it would shut down, I had to print out all my writings, and so I've got like somewhere around here I've got a foot tall thing of A4 that's got all the stuff that I wrote for the play by email sim. What, in your opinion, makes a good ship if there is a math to it? Like, I don't see the Archer Reed thing, but somebody else does maybe.
It's so personal. Like, I don't really enjoy the canon relationships on Star Trek. So where I have ships, they're either the couples who love each other but never get together for reasons, like Picard and Beverly or Janeway Chakotay, or who have been together in the past and are no longer for reasons. Like my current thing is Admiral Cornwell and the version of Prime Lorca that only exists in my head. There are dozens of us.
Yeah.
But if you put two Star Trek characters in a room and ask me to ship them, I'm like, maybe, I guess.
Yeah.
I feel like that's how some people who don't understand shipping think about it. They just assume like it's just people like randomly throwing darts at a board and just like seeing who can they pair together today. But like you said, it's such a personal thing. And sometimes you have a connection with the characters or the story, or like for me personally, it's always been the ones that I feel like there are so many unexplored stories to tell. And those are like the ships that I'm drawn to. And they can be any type of stories, happy, sad, alternate universe coffee shop, like whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, it's probably a lot to do with like dynamic, because I have one would say unique relationship dynamic of my own. So sometimes I have to look weird places for it. Like a lot of times it'll be like bro friendships. That's like my dynamic of my marriage. And I'm like, this isn't for me. And so you have to look more in, fanfic to find that relationship that I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's my life story.
Yeah. I can see that it's kind of a vibe. It's like it's a vibe that I don't know if I have, or maybe I'm like the Grinch. My heart has to grow 3 sizes. Because when I kind of just I'm not mystified by ships. Like I get it. But like when I watch a show, I just kind of accept what they're giving us, like obviously they're set, especially in a long form thing like TV. Clearly they want these two characters to be together. Part of the conflict is going to be them coming together and moving apart again. And so I'm just kind of rooting for that and not thinking, oh, maybe Mayweather should get with, so-and-so or something like that.
I've certainly shipped like that in the past. Like I think at one point I made it my goal to write Janeway with everyone in the cast, but I had a lot of free time then. And these days as an adult, even going back to childhood, I've realized I glom onto a character like Beverly or Janeway or Cornwell, usually the oldest woman in the cast. And then someone loves her or loved her once, and then I ship it. But really it's about that one character. And I might ship her with other people, but I keep coming back to this one relationship as well.
Yeah. I do have to say that I got to read your fic, The Weight of Your Bones, and I thought that was really fascinating and well written. And
oh, thank you. Was that my Cornwell Michael fic?
Yes. Doing all the things that you just talked about, like, you're the Lorca that only exists in your head, Prime Lorca, and taking the oldest woman on the show who we only just jumps in every once in a while and giving her more of a richer inner life. And yeah, it was really great.
Thank you.
Do you have, on that subject, what is the thing that you have written that you're most proud of?
I wrote a really long, very plotty fic about Lorca's experience in the Mirror Universe, and basically as the prisoner / personal assassin of Mirror Cat, and what he goes through there. And then I wrote the sequel from Prime Cat's point of view in terms of rescuing him. And I was I'm really proud of it. There's a lot of plot in it. There's a lot of complex psychology that I hope I handled well. People seem to enjoy it, and I had a lot of fun writing it.
Sasha, is there something that you've written that you would say that this is the best?
I don't think any of my writing is particularly good, so no, I would not say that.
Is there something that you could stand somebody else to read?
There is, actually. When I got into my channel and doing Shipper's Guide to the Galaxy, it was largely from an academic standpoint of wanting to explain the different minutiae of various ships to people who really don't understand it. It's more for like people who are on the outside looking in and like, what is shipping, what's going on. But I hadn't written for a while, and I started doing this let's play of this vampire game called Red Embrace, and I just got so invested in the characters, and I was doing a live stream, and I was like, oh man, I want to write a fic, and they were like, you should do it. And so I did it, and I think from that perspective, it's one of the things I love about fandom and transformative fandom is the interaction you get with the other fans, and just being encouraged to write that way, like again, and have people read it and have a conversation about it is one of the beautiful, unique things about transformative fandom, I think.
That's great.
Yeah.
Stephanie, what about you?
I'd probably say Star Trek wise, I'm more of a one-shot kind of person. And so there's this one little short fic, I think it's like 1,000 words. And I called it Consenting to Romance. And, my dynamic that I love is somebody who is generally kind of upbeat and is underestimated sometimes by other people, and people don't take seriously, or else they don't think they have problems. Falling in love with someone who's super serious, deadpan. Is that just my husband? No worries. Well, basically, Kirk ends up trying to flirt with Spock, and he's just getting dead-faced. And so eventually he breaks down in the elevator, and he's like, I want to go on a date with you. And Spock's like, is this a good idea? You've had so many flings. Like, is this a good idea for our crew? He was like, I take it seriously. And then Spock was like, okay, I consent to a date. And kisses him and then just walks out. And I'm like, yeah, that my spouse would do that. Frustrate me to no end, and then simple answer and then something surprisingly romantic and then book it. And I'm like, okay, I'm just sitting here more confused than before.
So I started out saying, I don't ship Kirk Spock, and now I'm like, I kind of want to read your fic.
See, the thing is like, I feel like real Spock and Kirk is very different than fanon, because the kind that exists as Spurk in the Tumblr younger person understanding that I know is this kind of not a himbo Kirk, but he ends up doing things that are more dorky, and he's smart, but he also gets distracted by his passionate interests. And then Spock is very serious, but he finds Kirk very entertaining. And so they just end up in these weird situations.
I think this is perfectly compliant with canon, and it's almost more compliant than the sexy ladies man Kirk,
right?
Right.
As a common interpretation of the character, because Kirk is super smart and super nerdy, and he is the guy who will quote poetry and novels at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
The
show likes to forget about that quite a bit and then randomly bring it in.
Yeah.
But it's also the context of the time and playing with the tropes that were popular, because every show had the Batman girl, the Man from Uncle girl, every episode you had to have it. So it's one of those things where it almost feels like, okay, it's time in the episode, where's the girl kind of thing.
Yes. Right.
We are running out of time here, but can you give the fans or the listeners your recommendations for a fic or a resource for fic if they want to get more into it? Sasha? Obviously, your channel, your YouTube channel.
No. I would definitely recommend AO3, because it's so well organized, and also because it has a very good include and exclude system where you can very much look for okay, I'm interested in this and I don't want this. And I think that's very helpful if you're daunted by the amount that's out there. So I would definitely recommend. And also in general, it's pretty friendly. So
Nice. Stephanie, how about you?
I tried to narrow it down, but I'm such a random reader that it was hard. But I do have this fic from a friend of mine who I really like. Hopefully they're not embarrassed about me mentioning it, but it's somebody called, they have not a terrible name, it's just weird. Their name is Vermin Disciple, and they have this, as I mentioned before, this happily ever after story about called, oh god, This Be the Verse, about Julian and Garrick settling down and adopting a kid, Jedzia and Worf, Jedzia not dying and then getting to have a kid, and Kira and Odo not having their ending, and getting to have a future, and how their families would intermix and their kids would have a future together as 3 different characters, and it was really cool. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, and what the title was again?
This Be the Verse.
This Be the Verse.
It's on
okay.
AO3.
Sure. Liz, what about you?
There is a magnificent series of fics from the 90s that have been copied over to AO3 called Talking Stick / Circle. It's a series of Janeway Chakotay fics co-written by a Native American man and a white woman. They started very, very early in Voyager Season 2, so it goes off canon quite fast. But it really, really makes a difference to see the character of Chakotay written by a Native American person. And the depth of respect for culture, for the characters, and for the universe is amazing. And it's het fic that's not heteronormative, which was a big, big deal in the 90s. And it's just marvelously well written.
What was it called again? I really do have to write this down.
Talking Stick / Circle.
Okay, cool.
Well, I wish that we could do justice to the subject. Maybe it was never possible, but I think that we took a big bite out of it. And I want to thank all of you for joining me today. This is a fascinating topic. There's so much to learn about it and enjoy. And I hope that listeners want to learn more. Can you let us know where we can find each of you and your work online? Liz?
I'm on Twitter at _Liz Barr, LizBarr. And you can find my podcast, Antimatter Pod, at antimatterpod.com.
And Sasha, where can we find you online?
You can find me at Casually Comics or at Shipper's Guide to the Galaxy on YouTube.
Great. Stephanie?
Best place to find me is probably my portfolio site, because I write for too many places. But it's www.stephanieroehler.com. And then I often write for places like Collider and GamePer and Star Trek. And hopefully I am working on a book. So maybe soon that.
Yeah, good luck with that. Well, thanks again for joining me, everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mikan Hana.
And I'm Caliban.
I am a huge Sailor Moon fan. I've been a Moonie since the beginning. I've seen every episode, every movie. I've read all the manga. I love it.
I've got a head full of bad wiring, and I've never seen a single episode.
Do you want to join the wonderful world of Sailor Moon?
Okay. Enter laughing. It's hard to believe that was us. It feels like ancient history.
We recorded that a few minutes ago.
Ancient history, but now that I'm a Sailor Moon expert.
You're not an expert?
But I'm trying.
Every week on Sailor Noob, we talk about a new episode of the original Sailor Moon series.
It's all new to me.
And I'm a little more seasoned. I've been a Japanese language student, and I've lived in Japan.
And you use your experiences to talk about the food, fashion, and culture of every episode of Sailor Moon.
What do you do again?
Share in the wonder of a classic anime series.
Good enough. Sailor Noob is a great companion for first-time watchers, and it is a fun hit of nostalgia for the experienced fan.
You can catch the show every Friday wherever you get your podcasts.
And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr, posting all things Sailor Moon.
One day I shall be the master.
Let's just get through this series first.
Okay.